So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find in the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzayelic lineage. So then we understand the time of the end, period Shiach, the prophet. We find in the 61st chapter related with the time of the restoration of the holy cities of the Messiah. And also studying Daniel the prophet and Daniel the politician, Daniel then the tradesperson, we find areas of the prophetic understanding translated in conversations then spoken in Aramaic. So it's very important being acquainted with the spring feast and autumn feast in Aramaic and also in the Greco language, obviously. But then mostly related with the time of the restoration and the preparation for the autumn feast. So Daniel, he has many layers of understanding of the time of the end, and some of them we find then obviously the angel speaking with him while he was then in a dream, and while he was then dreaming, he was having visions as if he was then watching a video. But then the angel spoke many times, and when we read in the scripture related with shut up the words until the time of the end, it's truly not what was said. Truly the understanding is write or record the understandings up to this point until later when the vision becomes completed, because it was giving in layers of understanding. So then, when you begin to read the scripture and understand the layers, it's not at once and at the same time. There are areas of the relationship with the heaven and earth where then the Gentile level also included, and it's precisely then what Daniel the prophet is explaining from a viewpoint of Gentile. But then there are visions and dreams related with these, and then each of those layers, they have a starting point and ending point of the vision itself, but then as part of another layer, making it completed. So even the translators did not understand the relationship of the conversation with the layers of each of those. As the Messiah said, not a layer is going to be left undone. Because the Messiah, when he was speaking of the scripture, he was always layering understanding. Though he was expounding then obviously the instructions, but he was always pointing the people understanding the layers of each of them. And as then Daniel began his quest and understanding then what those visions meant, he received the layers of understanding. So then he began a factor of reminding himself of the 70 years captivity, because it was layered with instructions regarding then the holy Shabbat year. And the nation then, 490 years, they owned the land, they never kept then the yearly Shabbat, and it was then making a total of 70 years of Shabbat the nation never kept. So then when he was understanding this area, he began then layering those understandings. So then when we find Daniel trying to make sense out of those visions and understanding and then explanation of the angel, he was trying to make an understanding of his own, and he became sick because he couldn't understand what those meant. But those were not for his luxury understanding what those meant. He was not prepared for understanding in layers. And that's why then the angel at the end is explained to him. He said then precisely, make sure then only record what thus far you watched, and make sure then finish this layer of understanding, because later there are more layers with the starting and end where they must be placed upon another. thus understanding in layers, because we are speaking of many generations of times and seasons. So when we read this instruction, we should not have the understanding of the translator and the words used. There is no situation of shut up the words and leave for the time of the end. It's not the point. The angel simply said, then record thus far the vision, and then set aside, because it has to be layered with other visions related with the time of the end. Then obviously related with many days yet ahead. So then encourages us, then each layer must be precisely then documented, then another layer precisely documented, another layer then precisely documented, and those they have from generation to generation, they have the steps of formation always identical. They never change those steps of formation. So then becomes then standard throughout the scripture. So each section of generation upon generation upon generation, they have specific layers of understanding, and those should match. Always harmonizing from the feasts themselves and the shadow prophetic events. So what Daniel was being instructed with was then the prophetic shadow of the events yet in the future, prior of a time where not even the spring feast was completed. So it was a huge undertaking, and then Daniel did not have the experience of understanding these layers. But then the angel simply said then for him to complete those understandings. Make sure then those later, they would then be layered with others. And as we read then, we have to layer Ezekiel. Sometimes we have to layer then Yirmiyahu, Yirmiyahu, depending on what understanding you are at. And then Galah and Daniel always side by side. So then makes the reading much more understandable. So then we understand the times and the seasons. Because not only a section or a layer of a writing you should be concerned with, you have to layer these with others from other generations, so then you can be sure your viewpoint, as it is harmonized with other generations from other prophets, with the same precise step of formation. Then your viewpoint, when it's harmonized of the whole vision, then you understand. Then you can say you are a revealed person. Otherwise, if you don't layer those many prophets, if you don't layer those many understandings, those dreams and visions given throughout the generations, if you don't know how to pair then Leviticus the 23rd chapter, the substance of the feasts themselves, and then the shadow prophetic events from times and the seasons, then you can't pick a point and speak of. It is absolutely lunacy when a person then picks a topic of the scripture and try to expound or expand the entire understanding without having layerings. The Messiah never did. He was always layering from prophecy, prophecy, and prophecy, and prophecy throughout generations. And in fact, when you read the 24th chapter of Michichiahu, you'll find the Messiah then layering what Daniel said as far as the desolation. So he was layering the understanding of the future with Daniel. Precisely then, not a layer of understanding would be left undone. So then when we begin this quest, then can you imagine what then people speak in their congregations? You begin to learn how the Messiah wants us to think, and then these understandings in our minds always loaded every time there is a topic being spoken of. So then we understand what the Messiah then meant as far as the base of the statue. We know where it's at. We understand the 11th chapter. It speaks of the time of restoration. We understand then prior of the 11th chapter, there is an explanation of the statue itself related with the Gentile level, except then the rock that comes at the end. And then it's layered obviously with Yeshayahu, the 61st chapter, layered then with Galah, and then obviously comes the understanding of our time related with the freighters of the earth, because then we begin understanding how Daniel, the politician and trader, began his quest as himself, as tradesperson, politician, and a person understanding the time of the end from this perspective. He was not speaking of governments when he was speaking of the time of the restoration. He was speaking of then freighters of the earth. So very understandably, when you layer Galah with Daniel, then you begin to understand the trading aspect of a prophecy given himself, explaining what it means from a tradesperson viewpoint. Then we understand previously the Ishmaelites were tradespeople. Then we understand what the Messiah is explaining in the freighters of the earth. So then we find the first son of Ibrahim already being an industrious person, a tradesperson, starting then the movement of the trades in the planet. Then we find later kingdoms being involved with it. But kingdoms, they are a situation where they should not be involved. Because the understanding from the holy perspective is then nation should be guided by a prophet or tabernacling. Kingdoms never were part of it. In fact, the nation, the set apart, they were absolutely reprimanded for having this crazy idea of having kings over them. Prophet Samuel was extremely displeased, but yet they were granted with it, and then when most of the problems became very evident. So then we understand kingdoms are not part of the restoration period. We have to understand layer upon layer in a way that then harmonizes the entire scripture. So then, again, speaking of Samuel, Samuel was the prophet of the time. He was the leader of the country. Then he was reprimanding the people for having the evil understanding of a kingdom. Then we find during the time of the restoration period where we have then tabernacling and trade. Because Ibrahim started with a tradesperson. Ishmael was a tradesperson. Then you find tabernacling as a guiding post. So those working together, we understand what it means truly. First and second son, time of restoration, trades time, where the world is going to be trading, no longer kingdoms, because kingdoms are not part of it. We do understand the formation of the base of the statue. Iron and clay are formed via kingdoms. Understandable. Geographic, it is understandable. But then if you then have this understanding as far as tabernacling is concerned, in the restoration of the relationship of Ibrahim and his sons, and what those represent regarding the time of the end, kingdoms have no part. That's why when we find in Galah 1:8 related with the time of restoration, we find no more kingdoms, but we find then freighters of the earth. Freighters means then trade, tradeship, time for trading. There is no more time for the scoundrelized governments. And the Messiah said then layered with what he said. That's why then the Messiah said, give to the government what belongs to the government, because when trade comes, then they are covered. If they do not charge, then taxes. Instantly, as per the layer of understanding of Daniel. Daniel said at the end of the time of the seat, from 1009 to 2009, would knowledge then increase? Increase for the purposes of trade. He was a tradesperson. So the consummation of this understanding of trade must end with the Ishmaelites. Prior of this time, then, coming out of the seat, then the kingdoms of the earth, they must relinquish themselves from leadership and acknowledge then the freighters of each of those kingdoms then in charge. So for instance, then the freighters of the earth of a nation, they're going to be very acquainted with the trades practice of freighting of another nation. And these other nations, they have the same or equal or similar trades practices of freighting of another nation. Why? Because the kingdom of the east, China, is coming with a system where then becomes neutral from nation, 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 and nation. That's why then the traders of the earth, because of the volume of parcels, the volume of ships, the volume of containers, they're going to start delegating what must be done to make their work easier. That's where they're going to start taking charge. As they do this, and then the time goes on, then the diminishing of governments is going to be very evident. That's why then we find, and then the kingdoms being separated. Not because they are not competent, but it's because of the time of the restoration of the trade. Then we begin to understand what it means, then the freighters of the earth. And then obviously the nations are going to line up with the freighters because they have a tracking system. But the governments, you can expect in the very near future, they're going to shrink and they're going to be very lean. And if they don't start then seriously charging taxes instantly per each package, every time there is a label printed of any box, any parcel, or any freight container, if they don't do this, later they're going to pay a very heavy price. The reason why, it's because then parcels are coming from many areas of the world. Governments, they won't be able then to sneak in somebody else's system. The dragon won't let. Then the situation is, if they don't have the movement of funding coming from subsystems into the big system, then they can't understand how much a person then is earning. So the only way they can gather taxes is when shipments are then sent. Any value of shipment should be then described in a fiscal note or then the packing slip. Has to have a system where then there is then the product, the description, and the price of it, where then taxes are deducted. Must be in this order. If it's not, then later, when the system becomes available, governments, they won't have any time to work with it. Because the number of volume, the volume is so, in quote, astronomical. They won't be able to near the function. We are talking about ships upon ships upon ships upon ships coming to the harbor because of the demand of packages. Many aircrafts coming in at the same time, cargo aircrafts, or then trucks lined up everywhere. And they want to unload their cargo and go somewhere else because they have contracts with other freighters. So we are not talking about only a person that's, there is this load over there for this price, but then it's a load of a month. A month's worth of a load from a certain company. Then you have to work for many types of companies to make then your total paycheck. So they don't have time to play around with a load. They have to unload and then get out of there and go to the next job. That's why then the Messiah was explaining in the freighters of the earth. He did not say only ships. When the Messiah explained freighters, he meant via air, though they weren't even existed, but the Messiah already knew. Then trucks, and then obviously ships. But he meant as freighters of the earth. So then we understand what's coming in the future. So what's coming is a real danger if the governments are not deducting taxes instantly. Every time there is a retail price of an item being purchased, the government must receive taxes. It must not be dependent upon the person, but it's dependent upon the system. Every time a preloaded label is then printed, must have the description, the price of the product, and taxes of each product. Or if you buy a bulk, then the price of the bulk. However, when they change this from the bulk to retail, there is another set of taxes that must be charged. So the government must work together to make sure then the retail price of the item then is taxed instantly when there is a label printed. Because if it doesn't get done this way, later the government won't be able to read what's in the system. Because the system must be private, must be confidential. We are no longer talking about governments taking charge. If the governments could read the new system, they would be able to have control over the system, thus control then the people doing trade with the system. So the reason why then the freighters of the earth are going to be in charge is because people, they're going to be then lords of themselves. So to speak, you're going to then be your own banker, your own investor, and your own purchaser. The government has nothing to do with you. You do your own trade at your own pace, at your own time. And if the government does not know how to tax you, bad for them. They are of luck. Because you are not going to give your paperwork to the government. You are not going to show your tax deductions because it is related with a foreign system. You may do taxation in your country. When there is then a proof of it, then obviously you have to do it. But as far as overseas system, there is no way of proving it. Because you have then a system where you download from another government. You are doing trade and investment of another country. And then you take your own earned funding and you are investing in it. But then you decide if you want a return to the subsystem, where you may be charged tax, or you can live there indefinitely and you don't pay taxes because the governments, they can't read what's there. Thus, then the freighter is in charge. Because then your direct power of your own system with the main system protects you from the government. That's why governments, they won't have any more authority. They have to line themselves up with the freighters, and they are going to become servants of the freighters. Then for these, if they do not tax each parcel, the government then is out of luck. Because there is no way in heaven or earth that's going to be there in order to give their taxes. Because the Messiah already explained, give to the government, belongs to the government. If people are not doing this instantly, not during the time of what the Messiah said as far as system-wise was concerned. Back then they used to trust the people when they had dealings, then they would give their taxes. Most of them did not, though the Messiah said to do. But then we have to layer the time of restoration with what then Daniel the politician, Daniel the tradesperson said, knowledge would increase. When you increase knowledge, you increase then your option of taxing properly with the level of the increasing of the knowledge. What do you understand of it? Computer. There must come up a system where every time there is a label printed for a box or then a container must be charged tax instantly, making thus first then freighters in charge because they have the tracking of the system. The government is there as secondary only to get taxes from. So they have to have the government in line with the freighter. But then because of the system coming from the east, each person is going to be his or her own investor and banker, and also a person with a responsible ending because maintain then the system always positive, and then the coming of these parcels from abroad. Thus governments then are separated. So what the Messiah said then is true, and the freighters of the earth would be then in charge. So what can we expect of taking place in the near future? Obviously, those who are wise, as the angel said, those who are wise would understand. Not because they are wise of themselves, it's because what the Messiah explains while pairing up and then layering these understandings at the same time, make sure it's harmonious, and then comes the understanding. So what can we expect? You can expect the governments, they're going to submit themselves, making partnership with the freighters because they have the best tracking system. We understand that our products from around the world come into their countries without any kind of a taxation. Then they're going to start lining up themselves with the freighters. Governments are secondary already, liking it or not. So they have to relinquish their power and understand the danger of the future, and very shortly, 36 months, we are expecting then a monetary system to go down, and we're expecting another system from abroad providing jobs for people via online. Absolutely secret and confidential. Property of another country. You have to be responsible. However, when the governments of the local areas, they don't tax properly, they're going to get in very big trouble. Because they have to deal then with the payment of their people. They have to be concerned with the maintenance of the roads, maintenance of the basic services, and then they have to extend the ports, extending then obviously the production of products from crude. They have to provide then space for more aircrafts, expand then the airports, and these huge projects, they take money. If they are not taxing properly, they can't go to the printing machine. The printing machine is no longer available. If you think of it, when you are then making dealings with the system, you even can pay people. You can pay your workers via the system. The government does not even know if you are paying the person or not. You know for sure a person is showing up for work. But then, is there any kind of a system where then prevents you from paying your own people via in a broad system? It's not even recorded in our own. But the Messiah said, and the freighters of the earth would be in charge. Then we have to understand the final understanding of it, and very concisely then retract back from the future. And then we understand why the freighters would be in charge. Because governments are secondary. And the only way governments are secondary is when there is a confidential system available. Individuals then would do trade with the system, making them in charge. And then because there is the power coming from the system, and then the freighters, because of the volume, then they are in charge of the planet. Then we understand later comes then the sons of Ishmael. As then increases the demand for transportation, so increases the demand for crude. The sons of Ishmael, they hold the most petroleum. Thus then the moral code from Ibrahim and Ishmael then being placed, and then they understand what it meant. So we know what's coming in the future. However, can then the governments understand what the Messiah has said? Or they are going to try to manipulate their way out of it when there is not much time left? There is only 36 months, or a set of 36 months left for this lining up of the system. Then we understand subsystems, or any system of any other government, must be in line with the freighters. How is it going to be in line? Every freighter must have a relationship with the local government, where then their tracking system begins then description, price, deduction of taxes. Description, price, deduction of taxes. Description, price, deduction of taxes. Every time there is a label printed. Thus then the relationship of freighters and governments. But because of volume coming, the freighters are going to be dominant. Governments are going to be secondary, very lean, only working with a bare minimum. And if the country is not taxing properly, they're going to be out of work. And some countries, they're going to adopt the Chinese system as their own very system. Because they're going to be in such a dire straits, they won't be able of having any kind of a movement because they are so far behind. And then the demand is so big, they're going to have a plot of land over there cleared away from the forest, and having tarps over there because they have no deeper to store than the packages. So what the Messiah said is very serious. We must understand what the Messiah said, and then it is coming. If we take it lightly, if we think we can manipulate our way through this time of restoration, oh, we are truly mistaken. We can't do anything else. Nations must do what's on the agenda. You can expect then kingdoms being divided because of the new system. You can understand then Europe, as far as the euro is concerned, dividing up themselves. We can expect then the imbalance of the subsystems if they are linked up together. And we can expect governments retrieving from their scoundrelization. Thus then giving power to people doing the real work. So this is what's coming. So let's be grateful then, because the Messiah already set the agenda of the future. And we must understand then the Aramaic language and then be acquainted with the many layers of these understandings. Because we are heading then towards the autumn feast. We have roughly 20 years left only. It's not much time. And then expires. So we are talking about of certainly a few more years of the luxury of governments thinking they can do the job when they can't. And then when the system becomes available, then a huge amount of packages coming through at any moment, at any time, and they are not going to be very nice. You know, there is no such of, because the government said they don't have space for the packages. You know what? They're going to give you a very short answer. It starts with F. They want the cargo unloaded from their trucks, unloaded from their ships, unloaded from their aircrafts, because they have other work to do. Governments have to deal with the problem with packages and spacing and the such. And then the freighters are only expecting, is the situation taken care of? So it's not going to be very nice. Mostly because most governments are lazy by nature. They are lazy people. So they have to deal with a very rough situations where then the freighters, they are not going to be very nice. Because they understand governments are lazy. So let's be prepared and take very seriously what the Messiah has said, because it sets the future's parameters.